Welcome to Wichita Liberty TV with Bob Weeks.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public policy. My guest today on Wichita Liberty TV is Dr. Art Hall. He is the founding executive director of the Center for Applied Economics at the University of Kansas School of Business. Before joining KU, he was the chief economist in the public affairs group of Wichita, Kansas-based Koch Industries. In that capacity, he worked with business leaders to help define how public policy initiatives would influence the structure of the markets in which the company participates. Before that, he was senior economist at the Washington, D.C.-based Tax Foundation, where he produced quantitative and qualitative research pertaining to the economics of taxation. And before that, he worked as financial economist at the U.S. General Accounting Office. Art Hall received his Ph.D. in economics from the University of Georgia. Let's watch my interview with Dr. Art Hall. Art Hall, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
It's my pleasure.
So my viewers know, and I think everybody in the city knows, that we're going to have an election with the sales tax issue on the ballot in November, an additional 1 cent per dollar sales tax. By far the largest component, about 63% of it, or about $250 million over 5 years, is for a new enhanced water supply. Now, you presented this summer at a conference in Wichita about water and really had some novel ideas about what we could do in Wichita to make sure we have the water we need without having to build a whole bunch of new pipes and all this type of infrastructure. Could you explain that to us, please?
Yes. The explanation requires a little bit of background knowledge. One of the hardest things that's going on in the world, and Wichita is no exception with regard to water, is that the water is not where the people are necessarily. So transporting the water to where the people are becomes an expensive proposition, but an important one. And I think inherently the popular support for the water part of the idea, people kind of understand that. The difference relates to, let me tie it in with the Governor Brownback's water vision. I began work on that under the auspices of Council of Economic Advisors. And briefly, one of the things that I really came to understand is who uses water in the state. And it's incredible how much agriculture, irrigation uses. Now, I say that because when you understand how much water is being used by the agricultural people and that water could potentially be purchased from those people for an alternative use, it becomes a win-win situation. All right, so if you understand that part, and then you understand the next part, and the next part is that Wichita gets about 60% of its water from Cheney Lake, and the other 40% from the Equus beds up north. Now, interestingly, the Equus beds is a porous aquifer, so it recharges at a pretty good rate. And in fact, people know that as part of the water plan is that there's this expensive project that is trying to recharge
the ASR project.
The ASR project. I don't know if people know it by that name, but there is about a $250 million project, if I understand the number right, that's attempting to recharge the aquifer.
Yes.
That is a good idea. Keeping the aquifer full is a good idea. Refilling it to the extent that it's empty is a good idea. Okay, that's the background. Now, the fact that Wichita has an aquifer that's rechargeable is part of the important part of my story. If you go out to around Great Bend, there's something called a water bank. And the reason the water bank is important is because there's a legal infrastructure over there that says people can trade water. And it's important to understand they're trading water, not water rights. Farmers and other people who use water in Kansas work hard to get a legal water right from the state.
So that's something that allows them to pump a certain number of acre feet or gallons, if you will,
that's right.
Per year.
That's right. And if you go back in history, in the United States in general and in Kansas in particular, there's an active encouragement to use the water for productive activity. And so we want people, in the law in particular, is organized to have people using water in a productive fashion. So granting water rights is something the state is eager to do. What's interesting then is that you have a lot of farmers who use a large amount of water. A lot of those farmers are also in the Equus beds. Okay, now Wichita has a well field in the aqueous beds, and of course a pipeline that brings water in from the aqueous beds. So one of the thoughts that I had is if you could allow the same type of water bank in the aqueous beds as you have out west, and the law is there, I think it would be a very straightforward matter to apply the law that currently exists to the aqueous beds. Then you could have a situation where the city could go to the irrigators that are using water from the aqueous beds right around the Wichita wells and offer them an options contract. Say if the drought is, if the drought meets certain conditions and, a variety of conditions are met, will you grant us an option to buy your water from you? Not your water rights, but your water from you for a certain amount of time. And we will use that as our ability to be flexible in responding to a drought condition.
So that means that during those drought years, the farmers would not be able to use their water, so they'd either not plant anything or convert to dry. They'd make adjustments on themselves.
And that would be part of what the farmer would understand is I'm making a legal contract to forego irrigating my land if Wichita calls this contract, but in return I'm going to get a payment for this water, and then I'll have to revert to dry land farming or some other type of arrangement, but the farmer and the city will have come to a deal that is mutually agreeable to both parties.
And I think what makes this work, if I remember off the top of my head some of the charts you've shown, that you've estimated that the marginal value of an acre foot of water for general commercial and personal use in the city is somewhat over $100,000 per acre foot. So this would be like the value of water to a restaurant, so it can serve it to its customers, wash dishes, cook food, and things like that. While the value of that same acre foot of water to a farmer to irrigate corn or something like that is only about $1,300 or something. Right. So it's almost a 100 to 1.
Right. And let's specify, because I think this is an important point. There's a difference between the value of water, which we don't really know because we don't trade water, and the difference between the amount of economic activity, or let's call it GDP, that's created by using water. And so if we create, if you look at the Wichita economy, and you look at how much value is created for each acre foot of water used, about 325,000 gallons used, it's about $135,000 per acre foot used. If you look at the value created by the farmers, the GDP created by ag, it's about $1,500 per acre foot used. Now, that huge gap means there's a market opportunity. And so the city or the people in Wichita who would like to buy water could easily pay the price that a farmer might be willing to accept. And that's the important part, is that there really is room for a market here.
And the other beautiful part, I think you may have even used the term serendipity, is that this is happening up above the aqueous beds where we already have pipage, we already have wells. I don't know, maybe we need a few more wells or something, but that would be very inexpensive compared to what we're talking about on the other end of it.
That's right. And my argument is if you are going to have a market, you need to have the legal infrastructure to make a deal, and then you need the physical infrastructure to transport the water. Well, that's where the serendipity is that the physical infrastructure for the most part is already in place. There could be engineering considerations that I'm not aware of. I understand that. But yes, for the most part, the logistics should be there if we allow for the legal infrastructure, which is essentially already in place in Kansas. It just doesn't happen to apply to the aqueous beds.
Now, the only thing I have to worry about is, do we have the political and bureaucratic infrastructure? Because this is a solution not developed at Wichita City Hall. It doesn't call for massive public works. It seems to be so simple that there's a big barrier there, isn't it?
I don't know. And I have to admit, I've backed into this idea. When I started working with the Council of Economic Advisors, I understood the idea of water markets, and I wanted to see if they could apply to Kansas, and they really can in Wichita. And so, to be honest, it's a new idea, and people need to get their heads around it. But it really is, in some ways, almost as simple as it sounds. And I would put forward that it's a one tool in the toolkit. But it is a readily available tool that allows for a lot of optionality, and that's the important part, the optionality.
Well, that's very good. Well, thank you, Art Hall. We need to take a moment off for a commercial break. We'll be back with Wichita Liberty TV in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm here this week with Dr. Art Hall of the University of Kansas. Now, we've been talking about the sales tax. We talked about water. The second biggest component of what the sales tax proponents want to spend on is economic development or a jobs fund. 20% of the 1 cent sales tax, about $16 million per year, would be used for different forms of economic development incentives. The eye is to create jobs in Kansas. Now, I know last night you had an anecdote of a business owner who's a supporter of the Yes Wichita group. Someone asked him, well, what if the sales tax money was used to provide an incentive to your competitor? How would you feel then? And I think the idea of your talk was there's the seen and the unseen things. And what if, this person didn't think that, well, my competitor might get an incentive.
That's right. And so when you start doling out these incentives, you're putting a lot of trust in the idea that a small group of people can pick out of a very large, vibrant economy the businesses that are actually going to create value. It's really important. We talk about jobs a lot, but I think it's absolutely critical that people understand that a job is a residual. If you are a business that's creating value for another person, then there's a basis for a job. The job doesn't come first. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. One of the other things I think it's important for everybody to understand is on average in Wichita, about 1,400 businesses a year start, about 1,200 a year die, and about 3,200 either are expanding or contracting, a total of 6,000. So as well-meaning as these investment programs are, there's just no way for a small group of people to handle the absolute volume. Okay, and then the fact that most of the most successful businesses over time start as very small businesses and then grow large.
And they don't have the time to go through all the bureaucratic application process either. They'll either succeed or die in the time that those decisions are made in, probably.
And so essentially what you're doing is you're pulling resources away from the next potential Pizza Hut or the next potential Cessna, and you're giving it to an established company, most likely. We don't know where the money will go, but I think if you know the track record of these programs, you know it's going to go to a big, well-connected company. And saving jobs, as noble as it sounds, may actually be a bad idea. And it's easy for an academic economist to say that kind of thing, and I understand the political pressures. However, if you're going to have a vibrant economy, you have to always be thinking about what's new and what's happening. And if you try to cling to the old and you try to save jobs, you're starving potentially new enterprises from the resources that would come from the people who are released from these businesses that are demonstrably not creating value for the society.
So it's kind of the creative destruction thing.
Creative destruction.
It's tough to lose a job from being laid off, but that frees up you to do something else. And
that's right.
I don't think that many people who lose their jobs think of it that way, but that's really what is happening.
That's correct.
Now, you talked about new firms, I think, and we oftentimes hear statistics that small business in America accounts for maybe 2/3 or 70% of all the jobs. But you really refine that a bit to talk about young firms, which is kind of like a small firm. They're not exactly the same thing, but it's the young firms and the churning. Could you explain those topics a bit?
Yeah, so it's often said that the small businesses have most of the jobs. And if you look at any particular chart at any particular point in time, you would find that that is true. But there's an important qualifier to that, and that is if you really look at what drives job creation and job growth, it's almost always brand new businesses. And most brand new businesses happen to be small. And that's where the connection comes in. And it's the brand new business, but here's the part that people have to understand too. There's an incredibly high symmetry between businesses that are born and businesses that die. And of course what you want is more being born and living than dying off, but that's part of the process of discovering what creates value. And if you create a business that has creating value and it starts growing really quickly, that tends to be the driver of economic activity. So it's a big experimental process.
And I know in your paper, Embracing Dynamism, we've talked about that a few times. You talk about creating conditions that allow as much business experimentation as possible. I think to a lot of people, average person, that sounds crazy. Wait a minute, don't you have a business plan and you've got all sorts of economic models and it's going to work, right? But that's really not the way business works, is it?
No, that's right. It's an evolutionary process, and evolution can be very messy.
Because if we knew which is the next Pizza Hut, the next Google, the next Apple.
Right.
We would just invest a couple $1,000
Right.
and we'd have all the money in the world. So,
That's right.
but we just don't know that. So instead of trying to pick and choose, and you've made the analogy to try and pick and choose stocks in the stock
correct,
market,
right.
another alternative is to just choose everybody,
Right.
buy all stocks, so to
Right.
speak, the indexed
Right.
approach,
Right.
and then make the conditions as favorable as possible in the hope that a couple of them will bloom.
Right.
And we don't necessarily have to get a Google or an Apple. I mean,
Right.
other smaller firms can be very good for us too.
That's right. In fact, I've shown statistically that about 600 companies over the last 20 years, about 600 companies have created about 65 to 75% of all Wichita jobs. Almost all of those companies started out as 3 or 4 people, and I guarantee you very few people in Wichita even know they exist.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, Art Hall, we're up against another time for commercial messages, so we'll be back with Wichita Liberty TV in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Art Hall of the University of Kansas. So we talked a little bit about the politics of the water program, and there's politics, of course, involved in the jobs program as well. You've talked about what I think in your paper you've called the caretaker approach to creating a business climate that offers opportunity for everybody, but at City Hall and at the state of Kansas, at the federal level too, they want to pick targeted incentives. And for people who believe in limited government and free markets like I do, and I think you do too, they say, Bob, what's your plan? Because you're telling us to do nothing, and therefore we're going to lose.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And you can understand the thought process, but and this is the reason for thinking about how dynamic and expansive a Wichita type economy is, why it's important to emphasize we have thousands and thousands of businesses either expanding or contracting, being born or dying. And if you want to capture that energy and facilitate that energy, then what you have to do is create a business environment where you're trying to incent as many people to get in the game as possible. And I think it's fair to say that what business owners care about are 3 things. They care about rules of the game being stable. They understand the process. Time is money. If I want to do something, can I do it quickly, right? And then, am I in an environment that's cost effective? And it's important to separate the idea of cost effectiveness from cheap. It doesn't have to be cheap. I mean, we want good police, we want good roads, we want good infrastructure, of course, we want good schools. I don't think the schools are as important for the workforce as just families want to make sure their kids have good schools, right? And all of those things can be done. My approach, and I don't think it's not doing nothing, is how do you set policies so that everybody gets the same deal? All investment, all entrepreneurial activity is essentially treated the same, encouraged, but not given special deals.
And I know when we talked about earlier in the segment about what if the sales tax was used to give your competitor an incentive. Now, a lot of people might think, okay, do we have 2 companies in Wichita, that manufacturing companies that produce the same product? Well, maybe we do. Yes. But more broadly, all companies in Wichita are competing for the same rents, warehouses, industrial space. They're competing for the same workers. I mean, a lot of labor is fairly generic. The guy who cleans an office down at Spirit is the same guy who cleans an office in a school or whatever. So it's really distorts the competitive landscape, I think, in ways that most people don't think about.
Yes, I think that's right. And then again, if you have favored industries, you really just don't know what you're destroying. And this is the economist's burden, right? You don't know what doesn't happen in the alternative world. And so if you're drawing resources from the community to target them to specific people, you don't really know what those resources are not now allowing. And it's abstract, but it's very important for people to try to get their head around that.
And the problem is the famous from Frederick Bastiat, and we've talked a lot about Henry Hazlitt's book on this show, The Seen versus the Unseen. Right. The things that government does with our tax money, the Interest Bank Arena downtown, a new water plant, groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Government makes sure that we see the good things that it does. But the bad things that it does, it gets buried, or it's so dispersed. And a matter of fact, the Chamber of Commerce really makes this argument. It's only 1 penny. You're not even going to miss it.
No, that's right. And of course, the flip side of the argument is that, well, what all of these numbers add up. We're talking about huge numbers. It might not be important for any one company, but if you look at the total investment that 1,300 small companies made in 2012 in Sedgwick County, it's $18 million. That's about 13,000 per company. Not a lot, okay? But that's already $2 million more than what the city's trying to propose to spend. And why is it that the city's going to spend that better than these 1,300 businesses? And of course, 1,300 businesses is just a fraction of what Wichita has. Every given year, it's going to be a different business with a different investment idea.
And another thing I think Wichitans need to remember is it's not like we don't have incentives now. When Boeing announced leaving Wichita 2 years ago, the city produced a compilation where since 1980, so over a period of about 30 whatever years, Boeing had received $658 million in property tax forgiveness, but that's not paid out in cash. Right. So it seems like the economic development people say, well, that really doesn't count. Right. So, but those things do count, don't they?
Of course they count. And in fact, you put your finger on a good point. What if every business, any investor who wanted to put capital on the ground in Wichita got a 5-year abatement? Automatic policy, no questions asked. Now, the city doesn't have complete control of it. They'd probably have to go to the state.
Right.
But that's the idea we're talking about. Let's make a policy. You don't have to get permission. There's no lobbyist required. It's just this is what we do to create a business climate that cultivates investment.
Because these programs, most of them are at the discretion of somebody. This investment committee in Wichita, the statewide programs, the PEAK and the HPIP, those are at the discretion of the Secretary of Commerce, I believe. So, if you're a political enemy or something like that, you may not get the benefit.
And I think more importantly, it's all being concentrated in a very small area. And look, the people who back these mean well, but they just don't see how big and complex the entire apparatus is, and they don't realize they're drawing resources potentially away from very important enterprises. They just don't see the unseen, as it were.
We don't know who the next Google or whoever it is, and we just have to allow them to thrive somewhere. And I make the case over and over again that these high commercial property tax rates we have in Kansas, they're very high, and then an extra 1 cent on the sales tax, it's just nickel and diming them, and so many of these startup companies are surviving by a thread anyway, but if they get over a hump, then sometimes they just grow, and we can't predict that. So.
That's right. So focus on creating as much entry and expansion as possible without special deals.
Well, Art Hall, thank you for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV, and that's all the time we have for this week. So come back next week. We'll have another episode of Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks.